Socrates awaits his execution, surrounded by his family and friends. They discuss together the immortality of the soul, what awaits him in the afterlife, the purpose of philosophy and its benefits for this journey, and also various other topics concerning the soul and the afterlife. Hello and welcome, or welcome back. This is Faith, Reason, and the Things Between, a journey through the great minds of history. Today we are discussing Phaedo by Plato, and I'm joined today by Matt Dory.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. Matt, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, all I really know about your background is that you're a convert to Catholicism.
That's correct.
And you're extremely articulate.
Sometimes. I try to be.
At least in our discussions. That's all I really know about you. Is there anything else you'd like to say about your background?
My background is that I have very little background. I have maybe 3 100 and 200 level philosophy courses under my belt, which is nothing. And I like to say that I know nothing less than Socrates knows that he knows nothing, which means sometimes I think I know more than I do. Fair
enough. Yeah. And we'll see what we think about what Socrates claims to know in this one as well. Okay, so Phaedo obviously covers basically the entire day leading up to Socrates' execution. His friends arrive early in the morning, and it's like 5 or 6 p.m. by the time he dies, by the time it ends. So presumably they spend all day long talking. And yeah, the discussion goes all the way around the afterlife, death, philosophy, what that has to do with that, and covers many other topics in between. But of all the places, he starts this dialogue talking about suicide. Apparently, he had heard one of his friends, either Simmias or Cebes, I forget which one, had heard some other teacher say that suicide was wrong, but he hadn't heard a great explanation for it himself. And one of Socrates' reasons that he gives for that is that we are the gods' possessions, and that it is wrong for us to leave without permission, basically. What was your impression reading that?
So I believe, so Socrates presents this idea that, I think what precipitates the conversation is that either Simmias or Cebes intimates that Socrates, that one of their friends, the great poet Evenus, has inquired about Socrates undertaking some poetry. And as we learn, Socrates has decided to essentially poeticize or lyricize Aesop's fables. And so they ask him about that on behalf of Evenus, and Socrates first clarifies that he is in no way trying to compete with Evenus, getting that kind of swept away. And he indicates that just to be sure he hasn't done anything wrong or missed anything, because he's had this dream his whole life that he should pursue the arts, and he assumed that that by that was simply meant what he was already doing, which is philosophy. To ensure that he had all his bases covered before he died, he decided that he would venture into the popular arts. And so with that said, they kind of launch into this idea of him preparing himself for death, and death being kind of like this ultimate good, which then Cebes and Simmias kind of come back and say, well, how is it good to die if it's a good to be, under the rulership of your gods? Because Socrates warns them that that although death is the ultimate good, you can't accomplish that end by means of violence to yourself. And so they're kind of pushing back and saying, well, if it's an ultimate good, why can't we do violence to ourselves?
Mm.
And he says, well, because you're also the possession of the gods. So there's this kind of interplay, I think, in the conversation between, I guess, lesser and greater goods, and the idea that even if something is a greater good, you can't do something that transgresses the lesser good in order to get to that greater good, because good is good.
Yeah. It kind of it builds off of a few ideas that are from previous dialogues, like Crito and the Apology. A little bit in the Apology, he talks about, my inner divine sign didn't stop me from getting killed, getting sentenced to death, so maybe death is good.
Right.
And then in Crito, he argues that under no conditions can you wish harm or do wrong to someone, ethically speaking. Obviously you have the freedom to, but like you shouldn't.
Yeah.
So like we kind of see those two ideas coming back and going further here. So yeah, you said that death is the ultimate good, and I think that Socrates would probably agree with that. And yet, my second point, in this topic of suicide, he says it's a very notable line. Very, I want to say it's the first time this has been said in Western civilization. For no one is it better to die than live. For no one. So, in the Iliad, you have plenty of people choosing glory over their lives. In the Odyssey, you sort of have Odysseus deciding to live on, even if it's a life devoid of glory and full of suffering. But this is the first time it's actually really been said out loud. Like, no, for nobody is it better to die than live. Under no circumstances can you decide, yeah, that's enough, I'm out.
Right.
On your own.
Right.
So, we'll probably get into the weeds on this, into the greater details, but how would you square him saying that death is the ultimate good with for no one is it better to die than live? Because that's a question that we have as well, even today as Catholics, as Christians. So it's a very relevant question no matter when you're reading it.
Yeah, it's one of the most important 2,500-year-old questions, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that I don't necessarily agree specifically with Socrates' formulation that death is the ultimate good. I think as a Catholic, we certainly are oriented in that direction because of basically our theology and what we know about the fall and redemption. However, it's not obvious to me that outside of that framework for understanding the world and creation, that death unto itself is an ultimate good, which of course Socrates is really kind of couching this within the greater point that the reason that death is good is because that's when you'll encounter ultimate truth, and this is really kind of the first time I think where we see that Plato's introducing his concept of the forms, right? And so he's saying this is the point at which you no longer see things that happen to be beautiful, but you see beauty itself, right? But then we have to sort of square these two ideas that it's not your right to die. It is the ultimate good to come into contact with what happens upon your death, but you can't, I guess, preempt that. And I think the idea that's being encapsulated in the conversation about being the ownership, so to speak, of the gods is this idea that even though it's not explicitly stated, your life is given to you.
Oh, okay.
And so your life being a gift is not something that you can take for granted, or that you can do things with at your own whim and your own will. That it does in fact belong to something greater than yourself, and so you have to, in essence, appreciate that good for as long as you have it. And to commit violence upon yourself, to commit violence against your own life, would be to fail to appreciate it. And so, in a sense, it actually does run counter to preparing yourself for death, because death is about having lived your life well. The ultimate reward. And Socrates kind of touches on that, where he's like, hey, if you've lived a really a life oriented toward pursuing wisdom, conceivably you will encounter that in the afterlife. But if you didn't, if you lived your life oriented toward base pleasures, then there will be something far less for you, waiting for you on the other side.
Sure. Yeah. So it occurred to me after I asked the question, that's exactly what his friends asked him. It's like, well, then, if you're living under the mastership of the gods, if your life is given to you by them, you're living, for them, for wisdom, so to speak, then why are you eager to die? And he takes quite a long time to answer that. A lot of which has to do with what you were saying. Pursuing wisdom, being a process of purification that prepares you for death.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And also that, well, let's just dive into that, I guess. I think that's really it. So the point of practicing philosophy is to prepare for death. He claims to distrust the senses, and that the only way to encounter true knowledge is through the intellect, through reason, basically.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of tied in with the idea of forms. But can you say what your understanding is of the idea of forms before we go too much further?
Yeah. So my understanding, which is a very basic understanding, is that the idea of the forms is that any kind of object that you may encounter in your real life, in your earthly life, or entity that you may encounter in your earthly life, is in a sense a derivative of a form. And so if I were to ask you, for example, to picture a triangle,
okay,
doesn't matter what that triangle is, you've imagined a particular permutation or iteration of a triangle. So maybe you pictured a right triangle. Somebody else might have pictured an equilateral triangle. If you have a very vibrant imagination, maybe it had a color associated with it. And the idea of the form is that there is this thing called triangleness, ultimate triangle, which you cannot see or perceive with your senses, because it's in a sense, it's this abstract entity from which all triangles derive. And so within itself has to be contained all of those possibilities. So it's almost like a pure potential. And then in reality, you have these smaller actuations.
Right. And you mentioned beauty before.
Yes.
Which might be an even more accessible example.
Yeah.
So like one could say that a waterfall is beautiful, or a woman is beautiful, or a painting is beautiful. But what he's saying is we recognize that each of those things is beautiful not because of, oh, well, they just so happen to, the ratio of the ratios of their figures, or the use of color appeals to their eye just so. It's not a scientific thing. It's like what he's saying, that we're recognizing with our intellects the
Right.
presence of, or rather the participation of that object with the form of beauty.
Yeah. It's interesting because, it requires, like you said, the intellect, it requires a subjective being experiencing something and essentially recognizing those qualities in something. And so this is kind of the tension that he has between the senses and the soul, is the idea that we're seeing things basically through a filter. Like beauty is something that this particular entity, say the waterfall or the woman, is exhibiting, but she is not beauty herself. And so because you're only perceiving her beauty through her senses, and there's a beauty behind her that kind of passes through her, then it stands to reason for Socrates that there's also a way of perceiving behind the way that you perceive with your senses, with your soul, if that makes sense. That's kind of how I conceptualize it.
It does, yeah. What's interesting about this is that I think you said before we started, if it's not too bad to be just a little off of the truth, but the further you go on that trajectory, the farther you end up.
Yeah, if you start at 1 degree,
right,
the closer you are to that divergence, it's just a very minute kind of deviance. But then the further that those two trajectories get out from one another, when they've arrived at whatever destination point they're going to have, they can end up being very far apart.
Right. So I bring that up because this is Plato, Socrates, and especially Phaedo, I would say, they're really foundational and important. It's a foundational and important text for discussions of spirituality, ontology, both in the Catholic tradition and in others. And you have this idea of forms outside the physical world, or at least outside of the visible physical world, and that develops in actually 2 parallel ways, one way and one the other in our tradition, which is, on the one hand, in AD, in early AD, I would say, the mind of God becomes the metaphysical home of all these kinds of forms, on the one hand. Whereas on the other, you have sort of Gnosticism, the body-soul duality, and the idea that there is nothing good at all in the physical, and that ultimate reality is entirely spiritual. Which one of those is Plato and Socrates actually closer to? I would love to discuss that. I think you can make a pretty good case either way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I definitely think that there are undertones of what we would now call Gnosticism, which is the idea that there is this duality between the body and the soul, and Socrates lays out this very complex argument for higher and lower goods, and really kind of the good of truth as encountered by the soul, by saying, look, the philosopher rejects all the bodily pleasures. He rejects the senses. And insofar as your bodily sensations and your sensations are essentially, from his perspective, skewing your encounter with ultimate truth, then you have to escape the body. And he actually kind of phrases it that way. It's like an escape or a freedom. Sure. As Catholics, I don't think we approach it that way.
No.
We see that life on earth is inherently good, and I would go so far as to say that, at least from my perspective, as a general rule, the things that we sense, insofar as we order our appetites, are good as well.
Right. And you're right. He does say that with the body you can only see through a glass darkly. I forget if that's Shakespeare or this. It could be in either one, honestly. He says that when the soul is free of the body, then you can more clearly apprehend truth, beauty, goodness, all the forms. But he also says at a few different points, things seem to run contrary to that. And this is something my professor told me in college. I'm not sure if I buy it, But he says that it's not so much hatred for the body, but disdain of being ruled by its desires. Now that's what he thinks. I'm trying to see, is that provable from the text? Can we discern that? At some points he seems to admit that you can come to some knowledge from the senses.
Right.
And then, he disdains the body, so to speak. He's very, very willing to face his death. And yet, I notice he's 70 years old. He has an infant. He can't disdain it that much.
Right.
You get what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
He's very clearly living a physical life just as much as a spiritual, philosophical one.
Right.
And then also, he does say, it is not better to die than live. You should live for as long as you can.
Right.
And then in Crito, he says, life is not worth living if your body is not in good shape. Now, not worth living. He says that about a few different things throughout these early dialogues. And his idea is not so much like die if you don't have it, but get this fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely an argument to be had about whether you can consider Socrates the same person with consistent views between each of the dialogues.
Right.
But if you do, then, and you square it all together, I think you could also take him to be closer to St. Paul than Arius. Like disdain of being ruled by the desires of the body.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. There is something to be said also for how consistent Socrates is as portrayed by Plato. And in the Phaedo specifically, we have a situation in which Plato is telling a story from the perspective of other people and does not announce himself as having been present. So we can say that this is probably a semi-faithful rendition of something that happened on the day or on the week of Socrates' death, but it's also probably a backdrop for Plato presenting some of his ideas, and so Socrates may conform to some of that. But I don't necessarily think that there's, at least as far as Socrates as presented in the stories is concerned, I don't think that there's necessarily a great inconsistency. I think your philosophy professor is probably touching on something, or was probably touching on something, which is that although Socrates, at least in the Phaedo, is talking about like this thing we have called the body, like, it's like a prison, like, let's get it over,
Right.
And then squaring that with like, well, but you also don't have a right to take your own life, and squaring that with the fact that, he does have a wife, he does have children. I think that there is a tension. I don't know if it's a full-on conflict. There's a tension insofar as, again, this is, the lesser good and then the greater good, and so long as this is where you find yourself, then you're kind of obligated to do that as best as you can. And I don't know if he ever explicitly states it, but I think it's kind of like the same as like making yourself worthy of the death that you're going to have. But I assume that apart from the pleasures, Socrates also probably sees his role as a husband and as a father as essentially a kind of duty, right? And this is how he frames having an excellent body and being in excellent health is like, he kind of frames it as like a duty, like this is your duty. And it kind of goes back to the idea, this is something that was given to you. These are the rules and the conditions under which it was given to you. And so the best thing for you to do is to remain obedient to those things and to treat everything that you get as well as you can treat it. The pleasure side of it is, I'm sure that Socrates enjoyed things by the senses. I think what he's then saying really is not so much that he doesn't enjoy those things or that he hasn't enjoyed those things. Perhaps he has less and less over the course of his life as he's become more present in the realm of the intellect. But it's more to say that, like the closer that you get to that ultimate reality that he perceives that is beyond the senses, the more that these other things that tie you down as far as your senses are concerned and as far as your impulses and your sensations are concerned, they tend to become a distraction when you just want to do this other thing. And I think we all encounter that, you know, as just in our everyday life. And he talks about that. He's like, you can almost never philosophize. There's always something that's preventing you from taking the time to do that, you know. And it's certainly something that I encounter. It's like, even just sitting down to read this, it's like sometimes it's like you just want to get through it. You want to have a good, solid encounter with it.
Right.
Oh, my tummy's rumbling. I need to have food. My phone's ringing. I can't turn that need to respond to that off. You know, a shadow just flitted across my room, and it was probably a bird flying by outside the window. You know, and all these things are constant distractions from the truth itself. But there's a kind of irony too, because as you said, he does admit that we can come to have an intuition of greater truth through encounter with the world of the senses. And so I think the tension is being able to choose when and how you have those encounters, and you don't have that choice as long as you're here.
So we've been bouncing around a little bit. Let's just wrap up our talk about the morality of suicide really fast before moving on to a few other threads that we left untied. What we have to understand about suicide as understood now in ancient Greece was if it was ever due to mental illness or anything like that, that's not how they were thinking about it. They were thinking about it as, like, you know, for honor or out of disgrace or whatnot, like to preserve honor.
Right.
We see that in the Iliad a little bit. We see that in the Odyssey as a way to escape momentary despair.
Right.
So I guess we should clarify that is the kind of thing that Socrates is talking about, rather than all the other reasons that we would recognize today. Is that all fairly consistent with what we believe as Catholics too, would you say?
Well, I think something that's important to bear in mind, which is something that I have not enough knowledge about, but a very basic level of knowledge about, is this idea that was developed really throughout the Middle Ages, and I think was encapsulated very well by St. Thomas Aquinas, which is the principle of double effect.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the idea that, I mean, before we get into that, just briefly, you know, to reiterate, like, it is good to be, and there are many goods in this life. And so the principle of double effect attempts to address this idea that sometimes bad things happen in the course of trying to accomplish the good.
Right.
And so the principle of double effect essentially stipulates, and I don't remember what the 5 points were specifically, but it essentially stipulates that there are times in which, in order to accomplish a greater good, a lesser evil is forgivable, insofar as you do not intend the evil in the course of accomplishing the good. You're simply trying to accomplish the good. You've recognized that as a matter of quantitative fact, I guess, that this evil is likely to happen. But you can't intend the evil to accomplish the good. And so the problem with suicide is that you are intending the evil to accomplish the good. If there was a way that you could die without intending to kill yourself, then perhaps that might be more palatable. But the idea being that you have to commit an act of violence, and you have to mean to commit that act of violence in order to get to arrive at that good. And that ties, I think, in some ways to lesser examples of intending an evil to acquire or accomplish a good. You know, if I'm very hungry, and I don't have any money, and I walk into a grocery store and I see this really delicious meal on the shelf being sold for, say 10, 15 bucks, but I don't have any money. It would be good for me to have that meal. It would be nutritious. It would be filling. It would extend my life and improve my health, but I couldn't intend to steal it in order to have it, even though it's a good, because there's also how you arrive at the good. And I think that's kind of how we would tie that ultimately together with Socrates's idea of preparing for death.
Right.
Which is like, and I think most people would agree, like, if you want to be good, you can't be evil to get there. And so the idea is, like, if you want to have a good death, you have to live a good life to arrive at that point.
Yeah. I have a comment on that. We're uncovering a lot of really fun topics. I want to make sure that we tie them up so that we can move on. You gave a bunch of examples where double effect is not occurring. Can you give one where it is?
Yeah, certainly.
In an ethically good version, I guess.
Right.
Doesn't work for stealing, doesn't work for suicide.
Right. And it's this is when you get into the weeds, because different people have different ideas about kind of the degree in terms of, how much foreknowledge of the bad that will happen ultimately crosses over into intending the bad to happen. I think this was something that came up, especially during World War II, with Alan Turing, and
yes, okay,
and the machine that they were using to crack I forget the name of the device,
Enigma.
Yeah, the Enigma machine, and the idea that they had to make a call about this was the only chance they were going to get, because as soon as they gave up that they had cracked the code, as soon as it was obvious to the Germans that they had cracked the code, everything was going to get changed.
Right.
They were going to lose it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they had to attack these positions, but these positions are also positions where civilian fleets were going back and forth, I believe.
Yeah, or they had to choose not to intervene.
Yeah.
When the Germans might have attacked.
Right. Yeah. So basically, to go here,
like
they had to let something else over here happen.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I guess for the audience to understand double effect in simplest form, like if a soldier jumps onto a grenade to stop him from blowing up his friends, his buddies, right?
Mm-hmm.
He has not committed suicide.
Right.
Right. Even though he's aware that his death is a consequence of that action. Yeah.
Because he's not intending to die.
Right.
He's intending to stop it.
Yeah. If he could do it and live, that is what he intends.
That's a much better example.
Right. Okay. No problem. Right. I think that we kind of covered his talk about moderation and treatment of the passions pretty well already. You can make an argument either way, that he's disdaining being mastered by the desires of the body, or that it's the body and existence as such that he disdains. You can go either way, I think. He does say, I just saw, it would be ridiculous for a man to train himself in life to live in a state as close to death as possible, and then to resent it when it comes. He's talking about, his life as a philosopher preparing for death, and, his friends ask, well, why are you so happy about dying? And then much earlier, just to tie up another end, he had said, or one of his friends had said, well, then why are you happy about dying if it means leaving the service of these great masters you talked about, the gods? And he's like, well, he eventually answers it as, I can expect that there will be even better masters in the afterlife. Did you
obviously from a theological perspective, I don't believe we don't believe in the multiple gods and the better gods.
Right, of course.
But the underlying principle that there will be something better than what you're encountering now. Yeah, I think I agree with that. And just to tie up one other thing about the absurdity of preparing for death and then not enjoying it.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for the fact that he's also just taking, even though he's not stating it explicitly, I think he's kind of taking a common sense approach, which is something that, as we realize, is not very common, which is you're going to die. You have to spend your life figuring out what you're going to do about that, because there's no scenario in which you're not going to die. Right. And so it stands to reason that if this is the course of your earthly life, and that is the end point, no matter what you do, there's never not going to be an end point to your earthly life. Then everything that you do is moving in that direction, and therefore you should be orienting yourself in that direction, because it would be kind of absurd to drive backwards.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. He ends up talking a little bit, well, quite a bit, about reincarnation. He's asked about the immortality of the soul. How do we know that the soul will live on, that it doesn't die at the same time that the body does? A very important question, especially for modern day, I would say.
Yeah.
And one of his arguments for that is reincarnation. Like, opposites come from opposites. Someone sitting came to be sitting by first standing. Right. Someone who is living came to be so by being dead first, is what he says. Or really the reverse. Someone who is dead, other way around. Someone who's living eventually comes to be dead, and then someone who's dead got there by first being alive. We wouldn't say that a rock is dead, because it was never alive. But a deer can live and then die. Human can live and then die. And he uses that to kind of make a cyclical kind of thing, so the dead then come back to life.
And this is, I think, what philosophers actually call the cyclical argument. Yeah. Which is the first out of the four that he makes. And so, you're right. He makes this argument that the existence of opposites tends to necessitate this cycle. It's interesting though, because the language gets a little bit muddied here, because he uses two different examples of two different primary categories of example for opposition that don't necessarily always overlap. And the first one, which is, like you were saying, sitting, standing up, these are essentially, well, actually, really, it would be more like bigger and smaller. These are what would be comparative or relative opposites, meaning that they are only opposite in relation to one another. So, for example, we could say that, if we put two objects on the table here, we would say that this object is bigger than this object. So this is the bigger object and this is the smaller object, and therefore that they are opposite insofar as this is smaller and this is bigger. But this is smaller relative to another object that might be bigger, like this entire bookshelf. Sure. How
does he connect that to the soul and reincarnation exactly?
Well, he's using that as an example to demonstrate how things will tend to fluctuate between one and the other, tall, short,
Got it.
Growing, declining, which you do kind of sort of see in the course of the human life, right? Like, you start as a baby and then you grow to a strong young adult, and then eventually you start to decay. I'm not sure that I agree that that's simply a process of bouncing back and forth between one opposite or the other. Right. And then just to touch on the other large category, there was the category of what we would actually, probably a more accurate term rather than opposites, would be contraries, which is the idea that these things are states that are contrary, not relative to one another, where you can be one or the other and bounce back. But so, for example, life and death are hard contraries rather than hot or colder, because there's no relative spectrum, right?
Yeah. That's
there's
really
kind
important.
of there's kind of a hard distinction, or like you know, for a really basic example, like round and square, as shapes. It's a hard distinction. They're contraries. One is a pointed object and one is not. And there's not really a gradient there. I mean, I'm sure there are some clever geometrists that would be able to show you how you could transition from a square to a circle. But on the face of it,
that's something.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So that's sort of how he comes to. That's one form of proving the reincarnation of the soul, or the immortality of the soul.
And we do have to what he's basically saying is like, if you take for granted, and this is part of the problem with getting through Phaedo, is in order for him to proceed with his arguments, he has to get Simmias and Zebes to agree on certain first points, right?
Yeah.
Because that's how argument proceeds anyway.
Yeah.
You can't actually, this is something that my philosophy professor always said, when you came to impasses, or if you just didn't even start with an agreement at all. So he says you can't have a disagreement until you had an agreement, which means you have to have a point at which you agree and then a point at which you depart in your agreement.
Yeah.
If you don't have a prior agreement, you just have a difference of opinion. So
got it.
This is kind of the murky water where we have to, in order to proceed, we have to let Socrates carry on with his point, and it begins with this duality of the soul and the body, and sort of the separation between, the hard separation between the two, which I'm not sure is necessarily a given, but
okay, yeah.
But if we take that for granted, just for the sake of this argument, Socrates' point is that if the soul precedes the body, and this is where we talk about opposites and transitioning between one another, right? Like, right. Soul into life, and then death being, it would stand to reason that if the soul precedes the body, or even gives the body life, then once the body has been destroyed, the soul would either revert back to a previous pre-body state, or it would carry on. It's kind of this idea, and the way I'm picturing, and this is a really weird way of picturing it, is if you ever, I know a lot of people in our generation will appreciate this, if you ever played the original Super Mario Brothers. I don't know if it was the Super Mario Brothers game, or if there was one that preceded it that had Mario and Luigi, but there was this little battle room that you were in, and if you went all the way to the right end of the screen, you would end up on the left side, and if you went all the way to the left side of the screen, you end up on the right side.
Okay.
That's kind of how I picture that cycle as he's presenting it. He's like, here's the soul coming from the place beyond life into life. It stands to reason that once life has ended, then the soul has to go somewhere, so it probably goes back to the place that it came from.
Right. Only to be reincarnated again, I guess. According to Socrates.
Which is how he launches into reincarnation.
Yeah. What problems, if any, do you find with his... Well, I mean, I guess you kind of already... You already gave one. His one problem with argument. You kind of, with his argument, you have to accept that, the pre-existence of the soul, perhaps.
Right.
And we would say that, if we were there, maybe we wouldn't have let him get that far. Maybe we would have made him try to prove that first.
Right.
But Simmias and Zebes just kind of go with it.
Yeah.
I guess the problems that I have with that are that and he touches on this a little bit, infinite regression is not quite possible. Right. So it can't have been, he mentions that souls go into animals or into plants or people. It's all the same thing. It's all the same souls. It's just they just go into different things in each lifetime. But you can't have that. You can't have infinite regression.
Yeah.
Forever.
You can't have infinite regression, and you can't have, which is kind of what you're touching on, you can't have this other, at least from our perspective, I think, you can't have this idea that, because I think he makes the point that it has to be a kind of volley between opposites because and a cycle between opposites, because if there weren't opposites, you would just have this kind of gray. He doesn't put it this way, but this kind of gray mush of things where
Sure.
nothing's ever one thing or the other. It's just all kind of in the middle. But it doesn't. The problem with this is it doesn't admit for the possibility that there may come a point where there's no life left in the created universe, and it doesn't allow for the possibility that, like, all right, so how do you how at some level it's also a problem with your data set, right? Because realistically speaking, you've got a very small data set, and it's like, well, all right, we're talking about reincarnation, and philosophers will encounter the divine. Really bad people will come back as like wolves and lions and predators, which I think is interesting. Like good people who weren't quite philosophers but were still pretty good will come back as like bees and other type of like butterflies and that type of thing.
Right. Yeah. That is interesting.
But it's like, how do you then account for the economy of souls? Like, is there a set number?
That's what I was thinking. There would have to be, right?
Yeah. Or you have to presume that.
He would be just assuming that he's working with only a small data set. Like, no, there are not an absolute. There would have to be either an absolute number of souls, meaning he would be utterly confused if the population around him tripled.
Well, there's that, and so it's interesting because there's a supposition there, right? The supposition is, without him saying it, and without him maybe even realizing that he's saying it, is he's supposing that there may in fact be a finite number of souls. But if there's a finite number of souls, then you have to square that finitude with the infinitude that he supposes lies beyond the created world. Yeah,
right. And, I guess to kind of bring this down to earth in a way, those are the kind of problems with it. And as you brought up, he recognizes that there is something beyond the physical. I don't know if he refers to it as infinite, but it's at least greater than the finitude here on earth. He would say that, I think. Okay, I see. I'm probably getting ahead of myself on that one. Just a little, but I think, now that I think about it, I think he does get there, though. So we will revisit it. As kind of counter to reincarnation, he says, can you imagine what it would be like if, it wasn't a volley between opposites, if being just always came in a straight line, then wouldn't there, if it just went in a straight line and did not turn back again to the other opposite or take any turning, do you realize that all things would ultimately be in the same state, be affected in the same way, and cease to become? That's his problem with not having reincarnation. Right. But because of infinite regression, I think you'd also have to say that at some point there's a straight line at the beginning, right? Right, yeah. So I guess there would just be a disagreement between us about how long that goes. Yeah, probably. Well, and the problem with infinite regression is, as I think St. Thomas Aquinas pointed this out, is in the simplest terms, there's a problem, which is that we have the present moment. And the problem with having a present moment in an infinite regress is that in an infinite regress, it would take an infinity to arrive at the present moment. So from a technical standpoint, you could never arrive at the present moment. And yet here we are. Huh. That's the simplest way I've ever heard that explained. Thank you. Okay, super. Okay, but for better or for worse, Sebes and Simmias accept that. Okay. They accept it. And then he gives another proof. He gives another proof of the immortality of the soul, which is recollection. Right. This is something he dives into a lot further in Meno, but can you summarize briefly what he means by recollection? So I think in the shortest or the simplest terms, what Socrates is referring to by recollection, and he gives examples which I'm not calling to mind, is that learning isn't really a process of discovering things
newly. It's a process of recognition. And so he perceives this recognition as a recollection, which means like, you know, if you observe something and then you're observing it for the first time, and then upon observing it for the first time, you can say, perceive a pattern or deduce something that's going to happen next. From his perspective, that means that there is this element of recollection, which means how can you intuit things if you didn't already know them?
And he answers that by saying, well, in a previous life you did.
Yeah, you already had that knowledge and you're rediscovering it, you're recollecting it.
Yeah. And you made a distinction, which I think is one of the flaws in that argument, actually. You made a distinction between recognition and recollection.
Yes.
This entire thing falls apart if you just accept that we have the power to recognize things that are logically consistent.
Right.
Or that make sense.
Right. Well, and from a Catholic perspective, it's interesting because he's wrong, but he's not wrong. Because all of these things are previously known. They're previously known by the one true knower.
Right.
And then in creating us, imparts that ability to know to us. It's interesting because I'm surprised at how he comes to this idea of recollection, or rather Plato, because I think this is really more of a Platonic idea.
Yeah, I think so.
Because philosophy, I think, really starts with basically two ideas in tandem. The first is that the world is knowable, and the second being that we are capable of knowing the world. So it just, and I probably skipped steps to arrive at this conclusion, but it seems to me that if the world is knowable and I'm capable of knowing the world, then it doesn't require me to have prior knowledge to recognize what's in front of me.
Huh.
It's just, it's like, I'm probably gonna botch this because I don't understand as much about AI as I'd like to think.
Oh goodness.
But it's this idea that, with kind of the explosion that we're witnessing with AI, you can give AI some simple things to train itself on, and then it can begin to extrapolate from there. But we know that AI had a begin point prior to which it didn't exist. It didn't have a knowledge.
Right.
And and this is kind of a bastardization of like the relationship between God and man. But if you think of like man as AI as God, then you can kind of use that analogy to say like God is the original knower. He is the original knowing, and then imparts that to us. And I think that's
in a smaller measure than he himself had it.
Yes, because he has omniscience, which clearly we don't have. But
right. But even with the man and AI, I think you can draw that a little bit too.
And I think then that's part of the problem. I won't go in that track. But part of that problem is it's only as good as the person who made it. But But I think if in a biblical context, this is at least one of a couple points that we can look at when we talk about what we mean by being made in the image and likeness of God.
Right.
It's this ability to know and to recognize.
Sure. I think another problem with the recollection is that wouldn't you also have to believe that in a previous life, or in a combination of your previous lives, you knew everything?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like that.
Right.
Like that's has to be a given in that argument.
Yeah. Simius asks, what are the proofs for recollection? And Sebi says, when men are interrogated in the right manner, they always give the right answer of their own accord. They could not do this if they did not possess the knowledge and the right explanation inside them. But,
he's right. They do possess the right knowledge and the right explanation inside them.
Right, meaning the knowledge of how to know and how to reason. But in the way Socrates means it, then how could it be that the guy who knows nothing about fishing and never did in any of his lives could have the concept explained to him and he would get it.
Yeah.
Without unless he knew everything, within a combination of his life, it would be impossible.
Yeah.
You can't have the ability to know. I think that's another infinite regress. At some point early on, you have to be able to learn to get the process rolling.
Right.
And that kind of makes
this is the problem, right? Is like,
right.
If all we're doing is recollecting, at what point did we just collect?
Yeah, that's right. I don't know what he would say to that. Okay, so that after he proves that the soul precedes life and posits that perhaps it lasts beyond the life of the body as well, he gets challenged by Simmias and Cebes regarding, can the soul be destroyed? There's kind of a part 1 and part 2 to this. The first one is regarding, he says there's composites and wholes in the world. There are things that are composed of many smaller things like the body, and given stress or given outside forces, it decomposes. Whereas there are other things, wholes, which are invisible, like the soul, like forms, he says. And those do not change. They do not decompose. They are whole, they cannot be changed. And posits that the soul is obviously more like one of these wholes rather than composites.
Right.
To prove that, it cannot be destroyed.
Right.
He even says that philosophy keeps the soul more whole and more unchangeable, whereas the more the soul involves itself in bodily things, by nature composite, it, makes itself more earthly.
Mm.
What did you think about that, I guess?
It's dense.
It's dense.
Yeah, and you have to start with the agreement with him that there's something of the soul that coheres in the unchanging, I guess. And this is kind of the system, right? Is like bodies are things that change, and they are perceptible to sense, and they're things that, like you said, they're composed of parts. They're measurable. They're quantifiable.
Yeah.
And they're destroyable. You can. I think the word that's used in this system, as they kind of outline it, is scatters. But things can be destroyed, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can be delimbed, and that would be a scattering of your body.
Right.
And therefore, in being scatterable, is mortal. And it's so if you take for granted that the soul is not beholden to these things, that it is something that is unchanging. And it's interesting because he uses, I don't know if this is a specific to the translation or if he means this in the same way that we think when we think about it. He touches upon invisibility as an attribute of the unchanging.
Yeah.
Or like the realm of the soul and the realm of the ideas is like it's.
I think it'd be hard to disprove that one, honestly.
Yeah, it would be hard. It's. Yeah, I guess he means it in the sense that like it's beyond the senses to perceive when he says that it's invisible.
Okay, sure.
Not that it's like the invisible man, like it's there, you just can't see it.
Right.
Really, it's like it is well and truly beyond.
Got it.
The senses.
I see what you
mean. And so if we take for granted that the soul is unchanging, it's invisible, meaning it's really beyond the limitations and the grasp of the sense of the world of the senses, the material world. It's simple, at least in his conception, and it has a complete coherence. It doesn't have parts to it. It's just a singular, coherent entity. Then it stands to reason that, like the ideas, it's eternal. And so, insofar as it has those same kind of attributes as the ideas, then the soul is made for the realm of the ideas.
Yeah. Okay. Cebes and Simmias both have strong objections to this, but they're quiet about it at first. I think it's it's a beautiful human moment, actually, where they're like, we don't really want to disrupt his peace. Yeah, he's ready to die. I don't want to say anything. And he says beautifully that, don't you know that the swan sings most beautifully right before it's about to die? Tell me what you think. Give me a chance. And he also, I think this next part is so important as well for us today. After hearing the arguments and before responding, he says, there is no greater evil one can suffer than to hate reasonable discourse.
Right, and that's his detour into misology.
Yeah,
and the idea that, and I think he provides a more tangible example where he's like, it's like misanthropy, in that.
Can you define that real quick? Misanthropy.
Misanthropy is like the general distrust of your fellow man.
Right, like you get let down enough times, and
and then you just don't trust anybody. And and so when you've encountered it, so misanthropy results from encountering a problem, and instead of allowing yourself to treat that problem as a problem unto itself, you apply it to the whole situation. And so you go, well, this person burned me, or I had a bad experience with this person. This must just be true of everybody.
Right.
And really what it was is that you didn't temper your expectations, and you didn't temper, you didn't have a reasonable idea of what to expect from your fellow human beings. And it's the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then he goes on to say that it's the same with misology, which is, a distrust of wisdom and truth, and the idea that, it would be easy to fall into saying that there's nothing that's really true, or nothing really worth considering as true, because you've encountered a couple of bad arguments and not been able to get your way out of it, instead of seeing that, like, well, this was just this instance in which you just had the wrong viewpoint or the wrong approach about it when you first approached it.
Yeah. Several times in this dialogue and in previous ones, he talks about the good, the beautiful, and the just. And I was always like, wait a minute. What I've heard is the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I feel like this is the moment, or this could be the moment, where truth kind of takes center stage. Where he's like, I am in danger at this moment of not having a philosophical attitude about this, because I'm eager to get the better of you in argument, even if I myself am not convinced that it's true. But he puts that aside to say, I myself want to be thoroughly convinced by what I say. I'm not just trying to win, I value the truth.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was a really cool moment.
Yeah.
The first argument from Siebes was that concerning harmony.
Yeah.
What if the soul and the body are like a harmony together? And so the strings of a lyre versus the sound that they make, right? Without the one, you lose the other as well.
Right.
Do you remember the problem with that?
I believe that Siebes is making the case that the soul might be seen as a harmony, which is that the harmony comes out of the instrument that's played, or maybe the multiple instruments that's played, but he just talks about the lyre. And so in this example, the lyre, the wood and the strings of the lyre are the human body.
Right.
And so his idea is that the soul is dependent upon the body.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you destroy the body, you destroy the harmony, because there's no longer anything there to play the harmony. And I believe Socrates later on, after he's considered both Cebes's and Simmias's arguments, I believe he basically tries to make the case that you've already kind of accepted this idea that the soul is non-composite, and that, you know, therefore to say that the soul is proceeding from the body is admitting that it's composite.
Right.
Yeah.
Or that it didn't pre-exist.
Yeah, or that it didn't pre-exist.
Right.
That's an interesting one though, because it's yeah, I'm not sure how Cebes came up with that one.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's like just who can come up with an analogy,
right?
And, who can point out the problem.
Well,
with
you're a musician,
sure.
So what do you think about it?
Oh.
I mean, even without touching on Socrates' objection to it, what would you respond to Cebes's analogy? How would you respond to that?
So the sound waves themselves, he's right. Whereas, like, I don't know, I think that there are certain harmonies, like between certain pitches, certain frequencies, that they're gonna work. They're gonna sound good even before you play it. And at that point, it's just when a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. Those two frequencies will always sound good together even before anybody had bothered to try it.
Right.
You know?
So there's a rule that precedes
in a
the
way,
sounds that would stipulate that they'll sound good together. But until they've been sounded, they don't technically exist.
Well, okay. Yeah, I suppose. At that point, you're in between like potentiality and actuality.
Right.
You know?
Well, and I think that's where, and maybe they didn't have sheet music back in.
I'd be shocked.
Back in 500 BC Greece. But the way that I was kind of conceiving that is like, well, I understood what he was saying about, you know, or at least what Socrates was playing about the soul not really being a harmony as a result of playing the instrument.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have gone a step further and said, and I know that this is very limited, it seems to me that the soul would be something rather like the composition that precedes the playing, right? And so
in Socrates,
the composition being the soul when played by the instrument, which is to say the body, then produces a harmony, which is what you basically the fruits of your life.
Sure.
Wherein you can certainly not follow the composition and you can break from that, but then what will happen is discord. Yeah.
Do you remember Simmias's problem?
Yeah, so Simmias's problem, I think, came down to the idea that, you know, if a man wears a cloak, if the cloak continues to exist, then you might suppose that the man continues to exist. But that's absurd because we see men wear many cloaks throughout the course of their life. And so he comes to this idea, like, how is it? He's like, I admit that maybe the soul goes beyond the body, but that still doesn't allow us to conclude that the soul is eternal and that it's infinite and that
it could just be long lasting.
It could be long lasting, and it is, you know. And so the problem for him is maybe it's that the soul has many cloaks, but we don't know. And just as a man will eventually come to the end of his life, we don't know how many cloaks the soul has to wear before the soul has come to its own end, and that's not for us to decide. And then what did Socrates respond to that with? Yeah,
so both now and when I read this last time, which was 5-6 years ago now, this is the one that got me.
Really?
This is the one that I started tearing up, to be completely honest. He says that some forms are contingent on each other. You mentioned triangles earlier. Triangle, in addition to the form of triangle, it would also come with it the form of 3, because it's got 3 sides, or the number 3, in addition to, like, okay, so like 3 pencils.
Right.
In addition to the form of 3, it would also have to admit another form that's in harmony with that, from which it can't be separated, which is the form of odd. 3 is not odd. Sorry, 3 is not even, it has to be odd.
Right.
And in the same way, fire and heat, snow and cold.
Right.
There are forms that are contingent upon each other. And so then he talks about life and the soul. And this is probably the only weak spot of it where it's not where you just have to take this premise. He says, what is it that gives the body life? And
soul.
Soul.
Yeah.
The number 3 cannot include evenness. It pushes away the opposite form.
The opposite. So he's kind of bringing back the argument from opposites.
If the soul gives life, then it cannot admit death.
Death, yeah. And I think the way that when you're talking about the examples of fire bringing heat, fire would never bring cold. And likewise, snow or ice would never bring heat. And if they did, they would be destroyed.
Right.
At least their state would change.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're right. His response to that is that if the soul brings life, then death is not a possibility.
Right.
Because they're opposites.
Yeah.
As long as one is one thing, it can't be its opposite.
Yeah, and this is different from when he said, like, opposites come from each other. He even stops and says, this is a little bit different. They can't be the same thing. They can't be different things at the same time.
Right.
When faced with its opposite, it will either be destroyed or given away or run away.
Yeah.
And he's making the argument that when death comes to the body, the soul itself does not admit death.
Right.
It just moves.
Right.
It runs away.
Right. Yeah, and I think this was kind of like, I'm glad that he clarifies that for Simius, because now without, again, doing it explicitly, he is kind of admitting, like, when I was talking about opposites before, I was being a little bit vague on what I meant by opposite, because there is a difference between relative or comparative opposites and then what we were referring to as contraries, which is that insofar as something is one thing, it can't be its opposite.
Right. Yeah. And so then he asks, is there anything deathless that is not also indestructible? And Simius and Cebes were like, okay, look, I give up. I'm sure if death can't destroy it, then I'm sure it's indestructible.
Yeah. I think sometimes people just give up with Socrates because he's so persistent.
Yeah. Right. And then after that, he goes into a long discourse about what he thinks the shape of the world is, what he thinks happens to the soul, and none of that is, I think, particularly important for the main thrust of this dialogue. But was there anything from it that stood out to you?
Nothing in particular. I think he does talk about, was it Anaxagoras or was it Pythagoras? It was Anaxagoras. And he was talking about this idea that Anaxagoras had this notion that, and I could be butchering this, that the truth of a thing sort of lied in what was best for it.
Okay.
If you wanted to know what something was all about, I don't know, a particular kind of plant, all you have to do is determine what the best course of action for treating that plant is, and then you would kind of get an idea for what it was. That it was a little bit of muddy waters. I know I'm butchering that.
I'm wondering if the best way to visualize that would be, well, like you said with the plant, like, you don't really know all that you can about it until until it's grown from a seed to being full grown.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. I have an outline here that maybe I can find it. But when Socrates was young, he says he was excited by natural science and wanted to know the explanation of everything from how living things are nourished to how things occurred in the heavens and on earth. But he realizes that he doesn't have the ability for these investigations, since they cause him to unlearn many of the things he thought he had previously known. And he used to think for existence that people grew larger by various kinds of external nourishment combining with the appropriate parts of our bodies. For example, by food adding flesh to flesh. But what is it which makes one person grow larger than another, right? Like, this is a big problem. If what is it that eating the same diet would make me, 5 inches taller than the guy next to me?
Right.
Or for that matter, which makes 1 and 1 add up to 2? And so he comes to this idea, and you kind of touched on this with like oddness in the triangle. And it's this idea that, the reason that 1 and 1 make 2 is because they actually both adhere in two-ness.
Right.
Yeah, he goes on about one day after his initial setback, Socrates happened to hear of Anaxagoras' view that mind directs and causes all things. He took this to mean that everything was arranged for the best. So he's already assuming that everything is arranged for the best.
Yeah.
Which I think we kind of that is a starting point. Well, it's a starting point in a lot of philosophy, right? This idea that, why is it this way and not another way? And it's like, well, the most reasonable explanation is it's the best of all possible worlds.
Sure. That's a Leibniz, I guess.
Yeah, probably.
A little bit. Yeah. We kind of even touch on how. So I forget if it's here or some other dialogue, but Socrates does discuss, like, he comes across this idea that mind directs all, and he's so over the moon about it. He's like, oh, that sounds amazing. I want to see somebody take this idea seriously and show me that it is. And he can't find anybody that does, not even Anaxagoras,
right,
who comes up with it, like, investigates it best. But in our discussion on recollection, or where knowledge comes from, I feel like we kind of outlined a way that he could have figured it out himself, by realizing that there is something in us that allows us to collect, not just recollect, but collect in the first place, the ability to know, to come to know.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, must come from somewhere.
Right. Well, it's interesting that he's like trying to come up with this idea that everything proceeds from the mind or the will, because this is and I'm having a vague memory of how everything fits together. I remember reading a book in my existentialism course by a gentleman by the name of Jim Holt, and I believe the book was Why Is There Something? And it was this idea of why is there something rather than nothing, and sort of exploring that seeming dilemma. And so he goes around and he interviews various philosophers and physicists. And there was one physicist who, although did not believe in God, did not necessarily believe in afterlife, and he was a quantum physicist. I believe his name was David something. He's a British quantum physicist. But he says, I have the intuition that it has something to do with consciousness. Of course, he doesn't believe in God, so he doesn't make that connection. So it raises the question of, can things exist without consciousness?
That was jumping way ahead.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's got its roots, right?
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, the long and short of that was this notion that, for example, does this book contain knowledge? It's a thought experiment. We were given a week to actually think about that and argue it out, whether or not the book contains knowledge. And what we came to was that a book only contains knowledge in potential, not in actuality. because it requires an interaction between two minds, an originating mind and a receiving mind.
Yeah.
With the idea being that if somebody wrote a book in a language that they understood but other people didn't, and somebody who didn't understand that language opened that book would have no knowledge for them. And so there's this notion that everything in the created world is knowable by us, but we're receiving it. We're not making it happen.
Yeah.
And so therefore, in order for it to be understandable, there must be a dialogue going on with two minds. Our mind as individuals, and then the mind of the person who's communicating it all to us.
Wow. Blown away.
Yeah, that one stuck with me. Has
Yeah.
stuck with me after all this time.
I bet. My gosh. Okay, so that does pretty much bring us to the end. He says, it is true that our souls are immortal, and a man should repeat this to himself as if it were an incantation, and a man should be of good cheer about his own soul if during life he has ignored the pleasures of his body and seriously concerned himself with the pleasures of learning and adorning his soul with moderation, righteousness, courage, freedom, and truth, and in that state awaits his journey to the underworld. Then after that, the executioner comes in. He says, all right, here's the hemlock for you. And he drinks it, walks around until his legs feel heavy, lays down, and just before he dies, he says something amazing. He uncovers his head and says, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make this offering to him, and do not forget. Now, Asclepius was a chicken sacrificed to him by the sick people who sleep in his temples is kind of a way of sacrificing to him and hoping for a cure.
Mm.
And Socrates, according to John Cooper here, says Socrates apparently means that death is a cure for the ills of life.
That's one way of looking at it. Yeah, certainly. I think that's the popular approach.
Sure. Yeah. Do you have a different one?
It's slightly different. I
Okay.
think.
Yeah.
I tend to look at it. Maybe this is an Augustinian approach.
That's
where
fine.
Augustine says that sickness is not a thing unto itself, but the absence of health.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read into the myth of Asclepius, before he was admitted into Olympus as one of the Olympic gods, he was actually killed by Zeus. And the reason that he was killed was because Zeus was terrified that Asclepius would grant to man immortality. And when you look at cures for sickness, it's not so much that you're getting rid of the sickness, it's that you're giving life. And so I think Socrates, he's being kind of playful in the sense that he's like, I've just had this whole conversation where I said I'm kind of iffy on the gods, right? So he's kind of making a joke, but he's also basically saying, one way of looking at it is you could say, yeah, he's been given a cure for the ills of life. But another way might be of saying, he has given me life. He has given me immortality.
Oh my gosh. That's a beautiful place to leave off.
Yep.
So there we go. Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.